So the stakeholders of climate change, going beyond the usual suspects. My name is Geoff Dabelko. I'm a professor at the Voinovich School, and for this conversation about climate change and who has a stake in both causing and the effects of climate change, I draw heavily on my experience working in the international policy context, international environmental climate change policy context based in Washington, D.C. for a couple decades, and then continuing to work in that space as a professor at Ohio University and through efforts like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in the fifth assessment. So when we think about climate change and who were the players, well, certainly it's a global issue, and we think of the fact that all countries, all people, all communities are part of that. And so we often go to the United Nations, and where countries each have a vote, and they come together around treaties. And so the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change from 1992 and the subsequent Conference of Parties that come together to negotiate and agree on the way that all countries are going to come together to tackle it. So certainly a key player is that international diplomatic community. We do that even at the very highest levels. And so as somewhat surreal as this picture is, this is in 2009 in Copenhagen, where literally the heads of state, the heads of the EU, came together around a table because the deal from the technocrats, from the lower level diplomats, just hadn't been done. And so it's difficult diplomacy that often has required strong leadership even to get to yes, where the agreements aren't necessarily that strong, as could arguably be the case in 2009 in Copenhagen. But it's one that, so at the very highest levels of leadership, there are stakeholders and there are players who are engaged in addressing climate change. Certainly, given what we know contributes to the problems of climate change, increased concentration of CO2, the burning of fossil fuels, the private sector, and in particular, companies associated with fossil fuels are central to the debates, to the politics, to the facts on the ground, to our energy profiles and the causes of the problem, impediments to solutions, potential solutions. But no doubt the private sector, and particularly the fossil fuel industry, comes in for lots of attention when one thinks of the short list of players for climate change. Pretty expected, pretty diverse. We know best some of the biggest, but there are some really big ones whose names may be less familiar, including some there. It's also the private sector is not limited just to old energy, so to speak, and fossil fuel energy. Renewable energy is, as we know, a rapidly growing industry, has small players, has some big or bigger players. Sometimes that's tied up with national level efforts, particularly in places like China or Denmark or Germany, where the industrial policy has the governments and private sector or business, we'll say, working hand in hand to move this forward. And so they are players in this space, increasingly more influential, louder players, but nevertheless relatively new compared to the historical dominant role of the fossil fuel industry. But again, the private sector in a different face, reminding us that those private sector actors are not homogenous. They're not common in terms of their interests, their tools, their technologies, their approaches, that there's a lot of diversity there, and it's important to not gloss over that or assume that the private sector as a whole sees these issues in the same fashion. The activists, the advocates, more recently, prominently, the youth voices. And so whether it's Greta Thunberg from Sweden, who in the last few years has achieved prominence, but certainly those those advocating often from a non-governmental perspective, sometimes as individual citizens, sometimes in NGOs, are prominent, whether they're in the room at that small table with heads of state deciding our primary mechanisms or not is a question, the influence they have there. Nevertheless, it's part of our short list of players when understanding who's at the table on climate change. And let's give a shout out to the scientists at some level. The policy and politics, maybe not so much. In some ways, they have their, for better or worse, sometimes the backs are turned to policy and politics because they're so focused on the science. And of course, that's the needed discipline that those disciplines require of the scientists. They explicitly see themselves as out of the public square, not appropriate as participants. Yet we're seeing some change there as well, with some prominent scientists, including some of the leading ones like Jim Hansen, making a transition in terms of roles and to the advocacy realm, or the more policy informed debates would not call themselves advocates, but would be active participants in providing understanding of these complexities to the public square. And in many respects, these are the folks who sit around the table, the negotiating table. The big suggests a big table, but in many respects, this is not a inclusive frame, but one that we kind of default to in terms of thinking about who matters in climate. So want to talk a little bit about what's a stakeholder. So I use players as the kind of shorthand, but want to talk about the notion of stakeholders to try to help give us the tools to more systematically think about roles and interests, and how there's a much broader group of important individuals, organizations, interests that can be part of it, and talk a little bit about the definition and who those are, so that we can make sure that we're getting beyond the usual suspects. And I would say make a case for why we shouldn't just limit it to the usual suspects. So to start by defining shareholder by what it is not, or stakeholder by what it is not. It's not a shareholder, but the words are connected, and stakeholder is a derivative of the more narrow sense of what a shareholder. So if a shareholder is individual company or institution that owns a piece of a publicly traded company, that's the folks who play the stock market and buy stock in companies. It's the presumed interest is making money, earning a profit, the company earning a profit. And so they have an interest, they have a vote, even if it's relatively diffuse in the actions of the company. And it really is assumed that everyone who is a shareholder has some basic common interest in maximizing the value of a company and a profit. And so in that way, it's a relatively homogeneous perspective of interest, where there's a shared goal, and there's not a lot of necessarily focus on the complexity of the interests, and also how the actions of the company are affecting those shareholders. Stakeholder is broader. Still, in a sense, shareholders are stakeholders, but there's lots more to it. Business, even in this stakeholder discussion, as we'll see a definition, still the business perspective is dominant. So while it's wider than a stockholder or shareholder and includes employees or vendors or partners, it still has that business approach. But what we're talking about doing here, finding some utility in talking about stakeholders, because it can, and I would maintain should, go beyond the business approach and can still be quite useful for understanding some basics of how we approach building climate resilience. So stakeholder, one definition, and there are multiple, is anybody who can affect or is affected by an organization, strategy, or project. They can be internal, they can be external, they can be senior, they can be junior. But the key here is that it is not just those who are affecting an organization driving the problem, but it's also what the impacts are, and how and who is affected by those impacts. And so you can imagine it's not just a question of paying attention to the fossil fuel companies, in part because their products are what are leading to higher concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere and driving climate change, our consumption of their products. But it is also that climate change is having impacts and impacting a wide range, and could maintain all manner of individuals, organizations. And so that notion of a stakeholder as somebody who has standing, in a legal term, to use the legal term, but has a stake in the building of climate change resilience because they're affected by as well as affecting the problem. And that inclusive definition really makes it an and rather than stopping at the notion of the kind of affecting inputs. If we don't have this broader definition, then the impact is to limit voice, power, standing to just a few. Those kind of, in some ways, those initial government, international diplomatic, private sector actors or players that we talked about up front. And so having this broader notion and understanding of what a stakeholder, who the stakeholders are, allows us to give greater voice, power, standing to the broad and full set of people for whom this is really a fundamental challenge. So think for a moment. Let's stop the video and think who you see the stakeholders are, and don't let yourself be limited to that initial list. Pause the presentation, jot down a list, see if you can get beyond the usual suspects. Okay, you're back. So did your list go beyond the players that we started with, right? So we had national governments, UN, treaties, private sector, scientists, lawyers, and court. But those parties are the ones, as we said, most directly affecting climate change. And it's important to have the key players, right? So not all, in some ways, stakeholders have the same practical status, or it's important to know kind of where they stand in a matrix. Here's one where power is on the y-axis, interest is on the x-axis. And so you can start to put, imagine yourself putting the stakeholders that you've listed in these different areas. So the upper right is a key player. There's high interest from the stakeholder and they have a lot of power. And so we can place them in these different areas, but part of it is we're going to have more stakeholders in our 2x2 going forward with our broader definition of stakeholder. But it is important to be able to position and understand, and this may be change over time, right? That may be the focus of our efforts in building climate resilience, is to move a powerful stakeholder, but with low interest, up into that upper right-hand corner. And so expanding the list with those with a stake in climate change, in some ways, can be a very long list. Here's a word cloud in the shape of the world that gives a sense of that. This is from stakeholdermapping.com, that it really can be an awful lot. And it's to make the point that really it's almost a truism, but that really this challenge that we have with climate change really is affecting all of us. It's not just the purview of those with climate change in their work description or their title or their formal expertise. And climate change has impact for all of us, right? I mean, in some ways, let's go to what the impacts are and understand that they are distributed geographically by resource type, which is this source of this Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change from the Fifth Assessment Map that's meant to give a sense of which issues and which places and which degree of concern. But not all folks will be affected, not all parts of the world affected equally. This is a WHO effort that has a variety of ways they calculate it, but in terms of excess deaths due to climate change, those in some ways in parts of sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia who are least responsible for creating the problem, right? They have low CO2 per capita profiles, are the most likely to suffer from these impacts for a variety of ways in terms of heat events and food insecurity and such. And so we start to understand that it's important to have these stakeholders who may not be at the short list of players, but boy, when we add the affected as part of our stakeholder map, it really is critical to have this much more inclusive list. Where do we look? From local, right here at High University and community all around the world, up to the global, because it is this global problem. And so developing stakeholder strategies or strategies for engaging them, certainly managing those most powerful, that's the expected. But where it gets a lot more interesting and where we need to move out of established patterns is to engage and mobilize those who are historically neglected in terms of having input in where our energy futures, our infrastructure futures, our economic growth, our livelihood strategies, and those certainly most affected, as we saw, poor, young, and old, indigenous and minorities, all parts of the world, not just the biggest economic players. Understand that it is a more diverse private sector, and entrepreneurs are part of the solution and ways forward, and not just the fossil fuel companies as the sum total of the private sector. We'll talk some more about faith communities, military, experience experts, which are those older adults, as communities that aren't, like I said, having climate change as their explicit mission or their toolbox and such, but these are the players that we have to be sure to include all across these different axes, so that we're make sure all stakeholders have voice and can be part of building climate resilience. We map them and we list them in part so that we can go through a proactive strategy development and manage them in a sense, understand at least the interests, and have kind of feedback loops that are always constantly moving and going at for each stakeholder all the time. So really this simplifies a much more complex process, but part of why we have to start with having that broader view of it. And then, as an old boss used to tell me, if you want me in on the landings, you got to have me in on the takeoffs. And so the importance of having this from the outset list that goes beyond the usual suspects is because if we are going to expect people in all situations to adapt and to change their behavior to try to mitigate and adapt to climate change and build resilience, then they have to be part of formulating that strategy. Their interests and their concerns have to be in on the takeoffs, because the kind of top-down imposed actions are not going to be received well, not going to have the buy-in, not going to have the legitimacy, and ultimately not have the effectiveness that we need them to have in order to truly move forward against this challenge that is posed to all of us. So to end up, the next step is to think through, pull out the journal and think through one of those neglected climate change stakeholders and identify them as going beyond the usual suspects and identifying some strategies for engaging them, because you've thought through how they are affecting climate change, how they are affected by it, and how they can be part of building climate resilience.